Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak. It really is a very exciting conference, and I'm very pleased to be here. An amazing performance already, committing all that to memory. So ROBINS E, as you can see here, stands for Risk of Bias in Non-Randomised Studies of Exposures. And I'm just going to talk about the tool. It was designed, in a nutshell, this slide says everything I want to say. It was designed primarily for use in the context of a systematic review. And although it is a tool, I see it mainly as a framework for helping people think about where biases may arise that affect specific results from an individual study that looks at the effect of an exposure on an outcome. And these are going to be observational studies, as they typically are for exposure studies in humans. And as you'll see when I talk through it, it goes through 7 what we call domains of bias and reaches an overall assessment. But I think it's the thinking that goes into it that is at least as important, well, probably more important than the results that come out. That said, results do come out about judgments of risk of bias that can be used in all sorts of ways. For example, as I've illustrated down in the corner here, they could be used to annotate a forest plot of results of different studies so you can see where people think the key problems are in those studies. So an outline of what I'm going to say. I want to give some background to the development of ROBINS E, and you'll see where the name comes from, for example, and then show how it works, the structure of the tool. I'll tell you a bit about one of the domains only. I haven't got time to do more than that, and I've picked the first domain around confounding, given the importance of that to inferences from observational studies, and make some concluding remarks. So, by way of some background, as Katja said, I've worked with Cochrane for a long time, and I started my career really working in clinical epidemiology rather than health services research, rather than exposure epidemiology or exposure science. And in Cochrane reviews, looking at the effects of interventions, back in 2006, there was, surprisingly, no systematic examination of the general issues affecting trials included in Cochrane reviews. There was a peculiar coded field around allocation concealment and then opportunities to write things in the methods. This is a mandatory table that describes an included study as it used to look back in 2006. And a notes field where people would write things that concern them, and they might comment on blinding or dropout and things, but there's nothing systematic. And so we thought that was a bit of an opportunity to develop something. We know that problems can occur in trials, and people should be looking for them if they're going to draw important decisions from Cochrane reviews. So working with primarily Doug Altman, a statistician in Oxford, we worked on developing a new tool. Because there weren't any tools. There were lots of tools out there, but we really didn't think there were any that really would work for Cochrane and the sort of things that Cochrane wanted to get out of it. So we developed a tool that we launched in the Cochrane Handbook, and we published in 2011. And here are some of the principles that we developed during the development of that tool, almost all of which I think are just as relevant today and have really driven all of the tools we've developed, including ROBINS E, that I'll move on to talk about. As others have said in the conference, we're not fans of numeric quality scores. That's what I mean by the top one. We're focusing on internal validity, and in fact in ROBINS E we draw, in all of our tools, a very clean distinction between internal validity and what we might call external validity. We're looking at risk of bias, not whether we should believe results, not how well things are reported, or how well things were done in a more holistic sense, which may be interesting, but those things may not affect the results, and we probably don't always care about them if they're not affecting the results. We recognize judgment is required for these things. I think it's really important to be very open about that. It was what we call a domain-based tool, as all of ours that we've developed from Bristol have been, and we choose domains of bias based wherever we can on evidence, empirical studies that show us where biases appear to be occurring, as well as theoretical considerations, because we can't get empirical evidence for everything. And the 6th is kind of specific to systematic reviews. I won't talk about that. And the last, it's the only one I think that we might refine a little bit, where we moved forward in this tool from looking at study-level assessments to looking at outcome-level assessments. What we've done more recently is move towards results-based assessments and acknowledge that you can analyze the same set of data in different ways with different risks of bias, and we need to reflect that in the way we think about these things. So we ended up with this tool that was more comprehensive, but rather open in that we just had these areas listed down the left, a judgment, and a free text field where people could explain what they were thinking about. Although we wrote a lot of guidance to help people fill in these fields. And that got adopted by Cochrane, and it's been very widely used. But of course, a lot of Cochrane reviews were including non-randomized evidence, which is really important for the effects of healthcare interventions, particularly in relation to harms or long-term effects. And there was clearly a parallel need for us to have a tool for assessing results from non-randomized studies of interventions. So we developed the next tool, ROBINS I, which was published in 2016. And in this, we introduced some modifications to the way we approached it. In particular, we introduced into each domain a series of preset questions to ask about the study within that domain that we called signaling questions, because there were signals to whether there was a risk of bias. And we copied that from another tool in diagnostic test accuracy. And we also introduced, which we didn't have in the original one, an integration across domains to have an overall risk of bias. We thought that was important so that we could get a bottom line result, for example, to stratify results or to decide which ones to exclude in sensitivity analyses, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we realized that some of those great developments in ROBINS I, we should put back into the trials tool. So, we're forever modifying these tools. And we went back to the trials tool and we created ROB2, an updated version for randomized trials, in which we added more innovations. And we took the signaling questions, and rather than just having a series of questions and asking the user to use them to reach a judgment, we implemented algorithms that mapped the answers of those signaling questions to a proposed risk of bias judgment for the user to consider and agree or say, no, actually, for this reason, now I'm going to override that algorithm, which is perfectly fine if it's justified. And we also started introducing some variants for just one of the domains at this point, to recognize different sorts of questions we might be answering from randomized trials, which has evolved in ROBINS I, in the latest version, into different domains for slightly different variations on how a non-randomized study was done. So these three tools have most surprisingly been very, very well taken up by people, not just in Cochrane but elsewhere. I just put a few citation statistics from yesterday so you can see the really high impact they've had on people conducting mainly systematic reviews in healthcare. And it's not surprising that people were looking at these tools, as we were, and thinking, well, should we translate some of those ideas to another area of research looking at the effects of exposures? And we'd been thinking about this in the background for quite a long time. And a while ago, we reviewed the tools that were available, and we found that none really were great. I mean, there were 86, even back in 2007. There's clearly an area that a lot of people are interested in. But as I say, we didn't think any of them really covered the tools. But we didn't really do anything about it. But others did. And in particular, Rebecca Morgan and colleagues took ROBINS I and started thinking about turning it into a tool for looking at exposures. And these papers came out of her work. We eventually joined forces with them because we thought we wanted to be involved in developing something that built on the things that we developed. And so we joined them in 2016, and it's been a very long process of developing ideas, having meetings, discussions, lots of teleconferences, and lots of phases of piloting, people trying it out and giving us feedback. And we finally put a full tool online last summer, in August, and I believe some people have been looking at it. just to point out that all these tools and the latest for them we put on our riskofbias.info website, and that's where Robins E is currently sitting. I just want to acknowledge that this is a huge team effort, mainly led by Jonathan Stern and me from Bristol, but very much international and very key partnerships at the National Toxicology Programme and the EPA and McMaster, among others. And here is a list of the people who have contributed to the discussions leading to the current version. And huge thank you to everyone who's contributed. So, an overview of the tool. Just to repeat the purpose of the tool, it's to assess risk of bias in a specific result, one by one, from an individual observational study. Now, the tool that we've developed so far, and this is a huge limitation, I recognize, is only applicable to cohort-type studies, follow-up studies. And we are working on the whole family of tools that will address other designs. So at the moment, it's only for a cohort study that's looking at the effect of an exposure on an outcome. And we interpret bias, not risk of bias, that's a mistake. Bias we're interpreting as a systematic error or deviation from the truth. But we can't know whether a study is biased, so we can't look at bias in a study, but we can look at features of the study that we believe or we know are associated with this magnitude of effect, presumably through biases, and we can look at those as features that put a study at risk of bias. The remit of exposure studies is, I find, a little bit difficult to define. It's clear that Robins I for interventions works primarily for interventions that are intended things that happen that someone or some group does to someone else, in a sense, maybe a clinician prescribing a pill, very simplist. And that's where Robins I works. We've developed Robins E primarily with things like environmental and occupational exposures in mind, but some of us are very keen that it's as widely applicable as possible. And I would like to think that it will work quite well for things at the bottom of this continuum, biomarkers, maybe even genetic markers. The grey area is probably the area that I've termed crudely personal choices. So, for example, there are Cochrane reviews on whether you should use electric or electric or a manual toothbrush. Is that an intervention or is it an exposure? And I don't want to get into this, but I think there are some of these things that could work in either tool, and some of them are clearly more towards an intervention and more towards an exposure. Though I imagine most of the people in the room today are, I don't know, right, primarily interested in the things that I've listed as exposures there. Here's an overview of the Robins E process for a specific study. And yes, it's quite an extensive process. It starts, of course, by specifying which result it is that we're assessing for risk of bias. Probably goes without saying. And I'm going to talk through the various aspects here as a quick summary. No, I'm not going to summarize, I'm just going to talk through them. So the first thing we suggest people do is something that we introduced into our thinking when someone approached us saying, well, I've got 100 studies here, they're all really, really bad. I don't want to go through this extensive process of evaluating all these domains for each of these studies. Can you give us a way to form a quick judgment? And we say, well, I think, yes, we could map to a really bad, a really high risk of bias by just pulling out the features that we think would lead to a study that is a very, very high risk of bias. And so we've pulled those out into an early set of essentially screening questions that people can use to avoid having to do an in-depth assessment and just put them into a pile of very high risk of bias studies that they may leave out of syntheses or they may address in a different way. And then, and here are those questions. They're about, was there any attempt to control for confounding? And if not, is that Is it such a big problem that really people want to put them onto this pile at the side? Or is the sort of measure of exposure really not appropriate for the research question they want to answer? Or is the measure of outcome really not appropriate for the research question they want to answer? And people would have to articulate what they mean in their answers to these questions, but they're prompts for people to develop criteria that would map studies to that naughty pile. Okay. And then we get to the two really important preliminary aspects of the assessment before we get into the bias domains, which are C, which you might not want to read. It's C. The third is describing what the study did. And the fourth one, D, is describing what the study tried to do, essentially. And I'm going to say a bit more about those two. So section C is about describing the analysis that led to the result that we're assessing. And it's about some of this is really basic capturing important information, specifying the outcome, the participant group. But the key things I think here are describing what the exposure was and how it was measured in the study. And the other question that, in fact, C4, I'm not sure we would need to keep that one. It doesn't seem to go anywhere after this. And then questions about how the study was done. And this particular set of questions, which are about whether repeated measures of exposure were made, channel the user into one of different variants of the domain about measuring exposure. Because there's only one time point measure of exposure. I think it's a simpler assessment to some extent than if there are multiple time points that are somehow integrated into a measure of exposure. So we just have slightly different domains for different scenarios in relation to repeat measurements. So that is all about describing what the study did. D is about describing what the study tried to do, by which I mean it's about specifying the causal effect that is being estimated by the result in the study. What in some fields might be called the S-demand. And we think this is a really crucial part of assessing risk of bias, because if you can't articulate what the result, what the true effect, what the true causal effect, how it's defined, what it is they're estimating, you can't really determine whether the study is estimating it free of bias. And this is all about comparing what the study did in C with what the causal question of interest is in D, is really the crux of what the ROBINS assessment is trying to do. So it defines what the result would have been if you could eliminate all of the biases. What the result would look like in the absence of bias. And we ask people to try and define it as a kind of features of a causal effect. In some circumstances, some people might like to think of it in a slightly more hypothetical way through imagining a target experiment where you could allocate different exposure levels in a randomized way. Because, a randomized experiment can, if done well, eliminate, it can prevent confounding and selection bias if you allocate people at the start of exposure and follow them up. You can't do this. It's not ethical. It's not feasible. But as a thought experiment, it can help define exactly what the causal effect is that the perfect, ideal, hypothetical randomized experiment would give you. It doesn't always work, but in some areas it can be a helpful device to think about what the causal effect really is. And this diagram illustrates how important it is, in our view, to determine the causal effect in the study, because it draws a distinction between what we're trying to get at in terms of risk of bias and the other important considerations of applicability of the study to the question we're trying to answer. And of course, the differences between what the study did and what the study is trying to estimate in terms of what causal effect exposure outcome effect is it trying to get at? That's where risk of bias comes in. Any differences between what the study is trying to do and what we want to know, that's the applicability of the study. And we draw this very clean, I think, distinction between these two. And everything we put in the tool, in terms of domains of bias, is really focused on things on the left, and we try and exclude anything that's on the right. So in defining that causal effect of interest, we first specify the population we're interested in, which of course may be a little bit different from what the study actually managed to recruit, or observe, as I should say. Specify, of course, the exposure, and crucially, the exposure window. What is the start of exposure that we're interested in, the time of start of exposure, and what is the period of exposure we're actually interested in? And over that time, how would we summarize the exposure? And this is all kind of hypothetical. The problem is, the studies don't tell us, epidemiological studies don't tell us exactly what they were trying to estimate. They just give us a number, and they call it an estimate, but actually what it's estimating is very rarely clear. And on the other hand, we believe it's essential to define what that is, otherwise we can't really think about whether there's bias in the result. And so we've got a problem here, which means someone using the Robins framework basically has to define a causal effect that they're assuming is the case in that study, often having to make a decision about what they thought the study investigators were probably trying to get at. And as long as we can articulate what it is we think they're trying to get at, then we can talk about risk of bias and whether the study got at that, and then we can talk about whether we think they're trying to get at how well that addresses the essential question we're trying to answer with our systematic review or whatever it is in the context of use of the tool. Especially, I mean, very rarely will it be clear what the start of exposure, the time of start of exposure of interest. What is the exposure window that they're actually trying to evaluate? Okay, so we describe what the study's done, and we define what the causal effect of interest is. Then we can move into the domains of bias and think about, well, how well the result estimates the causal effect. And we have 7 domains of bias. I'll just make them a bit bigger. They're bias due to confounding, bias arising from measurement of the exposure. Clearly, that's really critical. Bias in selection of participants into the study. This is the first of 2 domains around selection bias, kind of selection into the study. A domain that will rarely be very important, but sometimes it is, bias if exposure leads to intervention that essentially disguises the effect of the exposure, then that will be a bias in the effect of exposure, and we should worry about that. The 5 is the other domain about selection bias, selection out of the study due to missing data, and bias, of course, in measurement of the outcome. Second of 2 domains about measurement bias, information bias. And then the last one, a reporting bias, bias in whether they cherry-pick the result from multiple results to present in a report. And within those domains, we have signaling questions. I'll show you some examples of those in a minute. They're basically just yes-no questions, or they allow people to sit on the fence with a probably yes and a yes answer, which are interpreted in the same way. In some domains, we have a variation on this with, rather than just yes, no, we have 2 versions of one of them. That, for example, we say, yes, something happened, or no, something didn't happen, but it's not a big problem, or no, something didn't happen, and it's a big problem, essentially. And that allows us to channel the algorithm to channel the assessment to a wider gradation of response options. Those response options for each domain and overall, we have 4 levels: low, moderate, there's some low risk of bias, some concerns, high risk of bias, and very high risk of bias. There's one exception to this, is the domain on confounding. We don't think it's, well, we haven't yet to come across an example where we could call something at low risk of bias due to confounding when it's an observational study. And so we have renamed this domain low risk of bias except for concerns about uncontrolled confounding, which means you cannot get to low risk of bias overall using the Robins tool. But if anyone's got an example where they think that there is zero concern about confounding in an observational study, we would be interested to see that. So at the end of each domain, we have the risk of bias judgment, and we have two other considerations I won't say a lot about. One is predicting the direction of bias, which is straightforward sometimes, very hard in other times. And we've got this other thing, which is new to Robins E that we haven't had in any other tools, around whether the risk of bias and the direction of the bias and considerations of the magnitude of bias in relation to the observed result give us cause to believe there's a threat to the conclusion we would draw from that study. So this is probably more important when there are few studies or when you're just looking at one study in isolation. In the context of a systematic review, we'd normally accumulate these considerations across studies, in a meta-analysis anyway. But if we're bringing together studies of different sorts, then we might want to think about the threats to the validity of each of the individual results. Okay. And just finally, a lot of the people we worked with on this were rightly concerned about studies not being able to answer a useful question because of the way they're set up. And we talked about this at great length, and our view is that if they answered a question that's not helpful, that's unhelpful, but it's not bias in the sense of internal validity. Because if they set up to answer a question that, for example, only looked at a tiny range of exposure levels, that doesn't cover the spectrum that really occur in practice, then that's a very unhelpful study. But they may answer that particular exposure differential without a risk of bias. So we wouldn't want that in the heart of Robins E, but we recognize the importance of this. And so we've got an optional component in Robins E that we call appropriateness, that takes some elements of what some people call study sensitivity that are important but not strictly internal validity and runs through those considerations to get this kind of more holistic assessment that some people are keen to have. Okay. Just say a few words on one of the domains so you can see how it works. The risk of bias due to confounding. Now, we've seen this picture. I imagine most of us would be familiar with the idea, well, I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea of confounding, where we've got a common cause of both exposure and outcome. And that would introduce bias. And we should address that to the extent that we can in design, and usually we have to in the analysis, typically by adjusting for confounders in a regression framework. Of course, we also need to be careful not to control for things that could be mistaken for confounders that aren't. For example, things that are on the causal pathway from exposure to outcome. And even worse, things that are common effects of exposure and outcome, not confounders. So we need to make sure that if we're looking at a regression analysis, we are adjusting for things that are truly confounders and not adjusting for things that are not confounders that would introduce bias if adjusted for. So some of the kind of DAG-based considerations that would feed into an assessment of confounding. But how do we identify what those C things are? And the stance in Robins E is that we really need to think really hard in advance of collating the studies about what the key confounding factors are likely to be, or are, in this area of research. And we would expect anyone planning to use Robins E to identify the confounders and pre-specify them in a protocol or in their planning stage of the work. It's not easy, and almost certainly will involve experts and reviews of literature and possibly even some kind of analysis, big data analysis. And of course, there are lots, as I say, lots of ways to address confounding, and we're not, and we try to make sure that we cover all of these. We're not prejudiced towards one or the other. So if you pre-specify these confounding factors, and then you come across a study and you want to look at whether it's successfully controlled confounding, so that we could call it reasonably low risk of bias, we need to look at those confounding factors and look at what the study's done about them. So we invite people to fill in this table before going into the domain proper, just to get a good feel for the extent to which the studies address confounders. So for each confounding factor, we would look at what variables, if any, they had measured in that domain. So for example, the confounding factor may be socioeconomic status. They may have measured TV ownership or something much better than that. Were they controlled for in their analysis if they were measured? If they were controlled for, is it a good measure that accurately represents the confounding factor domain? Ownership of TV probably wouldn't, but something postcode-based would be better than that, for example. Maybe. If it wasn't controlled for, that's not necessarily a problem. It may be, for example, if sex is a key confounding factor, then a study in men isn't a problem. So we don't need to worry about it. So the fifth column there articulates these circumstances. Or maybe the study can demonstrate there's no association between the factor and either exposure or outcome in this particular study, in which case it's not acting as a confound in this particular study, and we don't need to worry about it. And then all the words in ask people to predict the direction of confounding if this thing were not adjusted for or addressed in the analysis. And then, so we do that for the pre-specified confounders, and we can add to this list as we go along. If we find a particular confounding factor that's important in a particular context of one study, we would want to do this for that. And maybe then think about it in the other studies if we'd forgotten about it. And then we get to the actual signaling questions in the domain. We're a long way through the talk. So we have 4 questions in our domain on confounding. And they stem from that table we've just seen in a rather natural way. So the first one, did they control for, using whatever methodology they thought appropriate, all the important confounding factors for which it was necessary? And I hope you can see how that falls out of the questions asked in the previous table. If they did, were those confounding factors measured validly and reliably by the variables available in the study? Because if not, there may be residual confounding, even if they were adjusted for them. And then third, checking that they didn't put anything in the model that they shouldn't have done. And specifically, did they put in, I'm just thinking for simplicity in a regression model, did they adjust for any variables that were measured after the start of exposure? Because they could be affected by exposure, and therefore are not strictly confounders. And then the fourth question looks for sort of things that give us additional clues about the extent of confounding, negative controls, or things like that can give us a handle on the extent to which confounding may be introducing bias. These are 2 of these questions are examples of our graded judgments. So the first one, did they control for all the important factors? That's not really a yes-no question. So we have yes, that's clear, if it's really good. But no, we might say what kind of a weak version of no, that's what WN stands for. Weak no, but uncontrolled founding was probably not substantial. Or a strong no, where no, they didn't put all the confounding factors in, and uncontrolled founding was probably substantial. So judgment's required. But I think it always is, and we're going to assess risk of bias in these sorts of studies. There's another example there I won't talk about. Ooh. And this is an example of an algorithm. I'm not going to talk through this. Just shows how we map from these answers to the signaling questions to the risk of bias judgments. Okay, so just to finish up, we hope this allows a thorough examination. I know some of the critical comments about ROBINS are how sophisticated, how long it is, how detailed it is. We don't apologize for that because it's a difficult thing to do. And you need to recognize it's part of a much bigger process. For example, the assessments coming out of ROBINS, one needs to do something very sensible with them, whether it's as simple as stratifying or using to understand the strengths and weaknesses in a triangulation approach, bringing together different streams of evidence. It's just a part of a much bigger process. It's not an end game in itself. And hopefully, for example, the considerations that go into an assessment would help us derive, well, maybe some quantitative bias adjustments. I'm inherently Bayesian in my thinking, so I would probably put a prior on biases based on the assessments I make in ROBINS. And just to clarify, it's very much ongoing work. We've got lots of plans for lots of tools. They happen very slowly. But we are working on ROBINS for case control studies. We are working on, we have plans for others, and we've laid foundations to work on Mendelian randomization, for example, is another option. Okay, I just recognize the funding of the tools. Thank you very much. I'll just end with a reminder of how to find out more.